Everyone, we are glad that you are joining us today. We're thankful that you're here and joining us for Cultivating Ideas. This is our webinar series where our faculty share ideas and insights that they have been cultivating in teaching, writing, and in ministry. And so we're grateful that you've taken time today to join us. Today, Dr. Bill Greenway will be joining us to present on the topic of the passion of Torah is the passion of Jesus, is the passion of Lent. And so he'll be presenting based off of his new book, In the Light of Agape, Moral Realism and Its Consequences, Interprets Lent in the Light of Agape, unveiling the singular reality, which is the passion of Torah, the passion of Jesus, and the passion of Lent. As always, y'all are welcome to let us know where you're joining from. We'd love to hear in the chat where you're joining from across the country and maybe even internationally. To be here with us with Dr. Greenway today. Please let us know that in the chat. And I'll remind you just to stay muted before while we're doing the presentation. And then after the presentation, you are welcome to come off and ask questions. And Bill has been very specific that we want to get to the presentation so we have time for conversation afterwards. So with that said, I will indeed turn it over to Bill, and I invite you to welcome Bill at however you see fit via waving of hands or reaction, whatever it may be.
So it's good to see everyone here. I'm excited about this. I've been enjoying these sessions, as many of you know, throughout the year myself. For those of you who are wondering and noticed the box down there that says Sylvia Greenway, that is indeed my mother, so don't say anything too harsh afterwards. All my work is part of a single argument, which is trying to work within the bounds of what is generally considered to be reasonable and good. And arguing for philosophical theology, philosophical spirituality on those bases, one that is intensely but not exclusively Christian. And I think with that said, we'll move to the presentation. I taped it so that I would be efficient and not, as some of you know, go off on the tangents. And then we would have good time for discussion. I see you grinning there, Brenda. It's a good thing that final project is already in. So, all right. With that said, Phil, I'll turn it back over to you and I will mute myself. The passion of Torah is the passion of Jesus, is the passion of Lent. A philosophical meditation upon Deuteronomy 26, 1-13. I am William Greenway, professor of philosophical theology at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and this is a chapter from my new book, In the Light of Agape, Moral Realism and Its Consequences. A collection of philosophical essays defending and reflecting upon the reality signified by agape, or, I would argue, by signifiers like Hesed in Judaism, Ren in Confucianism, or Metta in Buddhism. In this reflection, I argue that there is profound spiritual and ethical continuity between not only Judaism and Christianity, but also among Buddhism, Hinduism, secular humanism, Islam, and other faith traditions. I begin with a reading of the text. When you have come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, and you possess it and settle in it, you shall take some of the first of all the fruit of the ground, which you harvest from the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you shall put it in a basket, and go to the place that the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name. You shall go to the priest who is in office at that time, and say to him, Today I declare to the Lord your God that I have come into the land that the Lord swore to our ancestors to give us. When the priest takes the basket from your hand and sets it down before the altar of the Lord your God, you shall make this response before the Lord your God. A wandering Aramaean was my ancestor. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number. And there he became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power and with signs and wonders, and he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground that you, O Lord, have given me. You shall set it down before the Lord your God and bow down before the Lord your God. Then you, together with the Levites and the aliens who reside among you, shall celebrate with all the bounty that the Lord your God has given to you and to your house. When you have finished paying all the tithe of your produce in the 3rd year, which is the year of the tithe, giving it to the Levites, the aliens, the orphans, and the widows, so that they may eat their fill within your towns, then you shall say before the Lord your God, I have removed the sacred portion from the house, and I have given it to the Levites, the resident aliens, the orphans, and the widows, in accordance with your entire commandment that you commanded me. I have neither transgressed nor forgotten any of your commandments. Emanuel Levinas, the celebrated 20th century philosopher, grew up as a Russian Jew in Kaunas, Lithuania, just north of Belarus and Ukraine. As a boy, he was forced to flee with his Jewish community when the Russian Revolution swept through Lithuania. As an adult French citizen and army officer, he spent 5 years as a captive of the Nazis, and his entire immediate family, having returned to Kaunas, was murdered when the Nazis swept through Lithuania on their march into Russia. Levinas often cited a line from the Christian philosopher Blaise Pascal, "That is my place in the sun." That is how the usurpation of the whole world began. With that line, Pascal anticipates how ethics grounded in appeals to rights would not only be insufficient for ethics, but would be appropriated to justify political and economic imperialism. The well-known first fruits passage of the Torah, Deuteronomy 26, 1-12, strives to counter a similar imperialistic interpretation of the promised land motif among the Israelites. By the time this text is written, the Israelite conquest of Canaan is done. There is no undoing that, no place for the Israelites to go. The question is, what will be the character of Israelite rule? The author reminds them of their treatment in Egypt, where it was the Israelites themselves who had been identified as the aliens. Are they going to rule like the Egyptians? The author reminds them that they were poor and isolated immigrants, that their father was a wandering Aramean. How are they going to treat immigrants? We know from the history of ancient Israel that the Promised Land motif was used to justify political and economic imperialism. This is what Jewish prophets called forgetting God, which in concrete terms means forgetting the poor, the alien, the widow, and the orphan, forgetting that God promised to bless the children of Abram, a blessing applicable to all children of Abram, so that Abram and his children could be a blessing to all the families of the earth. Our author not only proclaims in this passage what it is to remember God, but embeds the community's remembering in an annual ritual of first fruits. In this ritual, one takes not the excess, not what remains after we're sure there's enough for us, but first fruits of the harvest. Moreover, because this is not just about a once-a-year exception, but about marking out a way of living in community, the people are told to take and share not only first fruits, but 1/10 of all that is harvested every 3rd year. They are to remember God by sharing all this with the aliens in the land. Note that in the context of Deuteronomy, most of the aliens are descendants of people who lived in Canaan before the Israelite conquest. One remembers God by sharing the first fruits and the tithe, so that the alien, the fatherless, and the widow may eat in your towns and be satisfied. That is what it is to remember God. Let's pause to be sure about the reason our author is saying this. It's because they love the aliens, the widows, the orphans, and the immigrants. They cannot make people love each other, but they can remind the people of times when they themselves were needy, when they were seen as strangers in the land, and of what they thought of those who welcomed and aided them. And they can say, remember God, go and do likewise. But is this first fruits philosophy realistic? Indeed, don't we know that it is patently unrealistic? Why not assert my rights? Why not establish means and security for me and mine first? I mean, let's be real. Haven't modern philosophy and science established that that is how the world really works? That the state of nature is primordially a war of all against all? Moral idealists like our biblical author are naive and dangerous, because in the real world it's a struggle for survival, and those who do not know how to play the game get eaten alive. So, go with the flow. Form strategic alliances. Do long-term assessments, and work to align others' interests with your own, especially if they are powerful. Ideals are great if you can afford to have them. But a first fruits philosophy is insane, because in the real world, people who refuse to compromise, refuse to accept reality and play the game, people who get stuck on their moral ideals, who do not play by the rules of realpolitik, in the real world, and this is actually true, I'm not setting this up to undo it later. This is true. In the real world, people like this get crucified. It is this hard truth that binds the Torah's first fruits passage to the crucifixion of Jesus and Lent. This connection is obscured by an understandable but massive confusion over how to understand Jesus' crucifixion and Lent. A confusion most obvious in tit-for-tat understandings of the cross. For instance, in the penal substitutionary understanding of atonement. Penal substitutionary theory claims that on the cross, Jesus paid the penalty for sin in our place. I say this confusion is understandable because not just among Christians, but in religions around the world, one finds a primordial conviction that the only hope of making up for evil is if, in a tit-for-tat exchange, some equally great evil is done in return. Accordingly, one finds sacrificial rituals in religious traditions across the world, where one does harm to oneself or to another creature to make up for some other evil. Tragically, this just increases harm in the world and compounds the offense. This point about the confusion of substitutionary understandings of the cross deserves more careful and compassionate discussion than I can commit to here. But let me stress that even people who articulate such theories of atonement have, insofar as they have indeed found forgiveness, they have found forgiveness in divine grace, which substitutionary atonement theories misunderstand. Womanist theologians like Dolores Williams and Joanne Marie Terrell have been particularly important in awakening us to the problematic ways in which substitutionary understandings of atonement sanctify and even glorify suffering itself, suffering for the sake of suffering. They have awakened us to the way in which substitutionary tit-for-tat understandings lead us confusedly to think that somehow perpetuating new evil, the infliction of pain or killing, will undo past evil. Such understandings of atonement lead Christians to see God as somehow pleased or satisfied with Jesus' suffering and death on the cross, pleased with the suffering and death itself. This is manifest when people are asked, what does the Passion of Passion Week and the Passion of Jesus refer to? And they answer, the cross, the suffering and death of Jesus on the cross. There are two confusions here it is especially vital for us to name and correct. First, there is nothing inherently good about suffering, pain, and unjust death. Nothing good about the suffering, pain, and unjust death of Jesus. Second, the God who is love did not delight in the suffering, pain, and unjust death of Jesus, and does not delight in the suffering, pain, and unjust death of anyone else. But then precisely what is the Passion of Passion Week? The Passion of Passion Week is the Passion of Jesus, the Passion of agape incarnate, the Passion of agape so perfectly incarnate in Jesus that Jesus remained true to this passion, to agape for every face, to the death, even death on a cross. It is vital to realize that the cross was a horrifying form of execution used by imperial Rome to terrorize subjugated populations into submission. As theologian Merit Trolstad notes, in 4 BCE, the Romans simultaneously crucified 2,000 Jews suspected of rebellion. Mass crucifixions of Jews continued through and beyond Jesus' time, numbering into the tens of thousands. The civil and ecclesial authorities did not execute Jesus so that humanity's sins might be forgiven, to appease God, or as some sort of bloody payment in a tit-for-tat economy. Jesus was executed because he lived surrender to having been seized by love for all the faces that surrounded him. And so he spoke clearly and forthrightly about that which was loving and good, and against what was unloving and evil. Jesus thereby threatened powerful figures and systems of exploitation and oppression, and as precisely as one would expect in a fallen, selfish, and violent world, those figures and systems responded to the threat by crucifying him. Jesus did not falter. The triumph manifest in the cross is the triumph of surrender to the passion of having been seized by love even in the face of massive imperial power and the threat of imminent torture and death. It is the triumph of faith, of fidelity to agape, fidelity to the God who is love, over desire for personal well-being and survival. In Jesus' fidelity to having been seized by love for every face that surrounded him, even unto death on a cross, we see, in the words of Emmanuel of Anas, a man who in the passion of agape was led to fear injustice more than death, to prefer to suffer than to commit injustice, and to prefer that which justifies being over that which assures it. God did not delight in the suffering and murder of Jesus. God delighted in Jesus' fidelity to love for all faces, fidelity to the passion of agape, fidelity to the love of neighbor, which is the love of God, even unto a cross. The idea that Lent or Passion Week are about the suffering and death of Jesus in and of themselves tames Lent, domesticates it by neutralizing its social critique. Christians can think of this in very practical terms. If you give something up for Lent that is not directly tied to justice for some neighbor, if giving up something simply creates suffering, if it is not about living surrender to having been seized by agape for some other face, then you have missed out on the joy and truth of participating in the passion of Jesus Christ. There is a debate in New Testament studies over how to translate pistios, or faith, in relation to Jesus Christ. Are Christians called to have faith in Jesus Christ, or to have the faith of Jesus Christ? That's the debate. But these are false alternatives. For to have faith in Jesus Christ is to have the faith of Jesus Christ, is to share in the passion of Jesus Christ. That is the passion Christians like me should remember and recommit ourselves to when we break the bread and drink the cup. That is the passion of Lent, the passion of Passion Week, the passion of Jesus, the passion for justice, the passion for neighbor, the passion of sheep who clothe the naked, feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, care for the sick, visit those imprisoned. The passion of Good Samaritans, the passion of kenosis, of incarnation, of Christmas. The passion of Isaiah and Amos and Micah. The passion of Bodhisattvas, of Siddhartha, of Gandhi, of Levinas. The passion behind the 5 pillars of Islam. The passion which experiences this veil of tears as dukkha, a burning. And it is the passion of the first fruits philosophy of the Torah. It is also a passion systemically elided from the categories of modern rationality and absent from the rooms where it happens across the globe to devastating effect. Just for starters, everyone with this passion would have joined with South African Anglican Archbishop Thabo Makgoba back in 2021 when he accused the US and EU of COVID-19 vaccine apartheid for their long-standing denial of patent waivers and threats to punish any countries who infringed upon patents for COVID vaccines. A first fruits philosophy would have insisted upon patent waivers and would have us ask not just about first fruits, but about third and fourth fruits, whether or not it was moral for we in the United States to get second and third doses of COVID vaccine, while U.S. foreign policy was by design denying vaccine to millions of poor people across the globe. And this is just for starters. All of this is connected to what has happened in Hong Kong, in Ukraine, in the Northern Triangle, to the plight of refugees at the U.S.-Mexico border, to the withering of the Arab Spring, to the school-to-prison pipeline, and on and on. For a brilliant assessment of the problematic geopolitical dynamics, and also for realistic suggestions for redress, see Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. Let me close with some thoughts about how Christians might celebrate Ash Wednesday and Lent. Thoughts which connect Lent to the Torah's first fruits philosophy. First, consistent with Deuteronomy 26's emphasis upon the alien and the impoverished, it seems Lenten celebrations should attempt to include, or at least explicitly to name and remember, those who are alien to their communities. People from other faith traditions, other ethnicities, races, or socioeconomic classes, especially those who are poor. Lent should not be a most exclusive season, a season just for Christians, but a most inclusive season, a season for those from any tradition who surrender to the passion of Lent. Second, consistent with the Torah's first fruits philosophy, especially as it is realized in the passion of Jesus, who spoke love to power even under the cross. Both individually and communally, giving up something for Lent should involve naming and committing time, social and political capital, and money to redressing some injustice, some violation of the poor or those considered alien. If you are poor or powerless, this might mean embodying the passion of Jesus by offering a word of encouragement or a gesture of love. What distinguishes simple self-deprivation from true Lenten sacrifice, from participation in the faith of Jesus Christ, participation in the passion of Jesus Christ, is this. True Lenten sacrifice is self-deprivation or risk which is directly related in word or deed to the love of God, which is love of neighbor, to the passion of Lent. For the most privileged of us, this should probably involve speaking love to power. 2 closing thoughts. First, all this means that the Lenten season is continuous with the Advent and Christmas seasons. Those who give up something for the sake of giving something up during Lent miss out on the joy of giving something up out of love for others, on giving rooted in surrender to the gracious love of God, miss out on a way of participating in the love of God. When one's giving is rooted in surrender to agape, it feels like a blessed opportunity, not like giving something up. So Lent is simultaneously a joyous season of giving like Advent and Christmas, and with its termination in the cross, ultra-realistic about the character of this world. But this world does not triumph. Surrender to having been seized by agape for every face, surrender to the passion of Lent, the passion of Jesus, brings profound joy in this world despite its crosses, and yields resilience. We are not ignorant of the reality and power of real-world social, economic, and political dynamics, but we neither see them as true to the ultimate character of reality, nor do we surrender to them. Second, full surrender in true Lenten celebration yields palpable communion with agape, which enfolds us and holds us and lifts us up. Communion in the passion of Lent, communion in our shared surrender to agape is so powerful and glorious that it instills in us reasonable hope that somehow it is not this world, but agape that has the ultimate word. In other words, it is from true participation in the passion of Lent that Easter hope is born. We Christians are mistaken if we endure Lent so we can get Easter. If someone does something for the sake of some heavenly reward, then ultimately they are doing it for the reward, for themselves, not out of living surrender to agape. It is true celebration of Lent, that is, full surrender to the passion of Lent, to the passion of Jesus, to the passion of the prophets, to the passion of the Bodhisattvas and Siddhartha and the prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. It is full surrender to passion for all creatures of every kind, especially those who are needy, suffering, or in pain. It is full surrender to that passion, to agape, hesed, metta, ren, that gives birth to Easter hope, to hope in heaven, nirvana, or the Pure Land, to the hope that in some unimaginable way, agape is the ultimate word for each one of us. Get this backwards. Ground everything in the promise of some heavenly reward, and one will miss the joy of communion with the God who is gracious love.
All right. Oh, there we go. Thank you,
So
Bill.
if you felt, I wondered if you could end it there or let it play to the end.
I
But
debated.
if people go to the YouTube channel and all you have to do is go to YouTube and search under William Greenway Passion Jesus Lent, and you'll find the video. And there's an Easter egg at the end.
There,
Uh,
yes, there is indeed. It's a great
after
one.
the blackout, kind
Yeah.
of.
Well, first, Bill, any follow-up thoughts that you want to share before we open to questions?
Well, there's a lot in there, but
There it
what
is.
unifies it is a conviction that what I signify with agape, which is the experience of having been seized by love, by concern for every face. That is, to use Levinas's words, how God comes to mind. It's hardly a radical or new thought. It's what it means to say God is love, as it's actually concretely experienced. And to see that and notice that at the heart of these various religious traditions, at the heart of the Torah. This is Levinas's reading of the Torah, but also at the heart of what it means to think of the Passion of Jesus, the Passion of Lent, and then as I gesture across these religious traditions. And so that's the unifying theme, or the unifying kind of primordial confession, which anchors all the other reflections and unifies them. I guess I'll stop with that and go to questions. Oh, and I need to look at the chat, maybe.
Mark, yeah, Mark, do you want to ask your question?
When asking Bill a question, I have to word it very carefully. So I'll stick to my text.
So I'll read it. Mark asks, in your language, you seem to push beyond surrender to agape, that moves toward a fullness of the spiritual life when that living surrender becomes our joy. In other words, to quote the Bach, is that chorale?
Chorale, yeah.
Chorale. Jesu, joy of our desiring. Does the Passion of Lent and Torah contain eros, not just surrender, but response, a desiring that finds its ultimate joy in agape?
So Levinas can be read very negatively. It sounds to me like there's more to the full experience of love than strict surrender.
Levinas is living in a time when there's a debate over art for the sake of art. And then there's people like Orwell who are countering that with saying, no, art needs to be for the sake of what's good and loving and just. And Levinas is overwhelmingly concerned with the Shoah. And so his concerns are overwhelmingly ethical. As a result, I would agree with those who think he shortchanges the aesthetic. There is a place for art being for the sake of art, just for joy, and there's a place for eros. But there are many people who then it's always surprising me how eager people are needing to get eros back into play. And that's why I want to insist that eros is distinct from agape. It's phenomenologically distinct. It's the use of the word desire there, I think, is tricky because the way eros is understood, and this is what makes it popular among academics to put agape within eros, or to move right to eros, is eros works within modern categories, modern philosophical categories. So, but there you lose what's distinctively religious. Or ethical. And for modern thought, ethics becomes a species of the aesthetic because there's no place for that other reality. And I think people I don't think it's in this sense a fundamentally religious impulse. So biophilia, what Wilson describes, I think this is a desire I have for other things for myself. Whereas for me, agape is having been seized by a love, and the surrender there is not, for me, an abstraction. The surrender is not just a kind of a spiritual stance that you do in your head. The surrender is feeding, is clothing, is so to live surrender to agape is to live action in the world, always concrete action. So to separate it from not just surrender, but response. I don't separate those two. The surrender is in the response. That's the sense in which, the sheep are surprised. They didn't know they were serving God. That's the sense in which God is hidden. That's the sense in which if you do it for God, the neighbor has actually disappeared. What the sheep do is they do it in direct surrender to agape for those faces. And in doing it for them, as the parable says, you've done it for me. So paradoxically enough, the sheep have to be surprised, because if they did it for God, they wouldn't be sheep. They would be goats who actually didn't see and respond to the neighbor. So that's for me where agape. So I'm all for affirming eros, but I think it is a distinctive category, and it can be good if it doesn't violate agape. And in ideal romantic relationships, you've got both a fullness of agape and a fullness of eros. In some relationships, which are exploitative or abusive or coercive, what you've got is eros without agape. And at that point, they become problematic. So I think that's the best way to do that. This question I find significant because I commonly get this counter from people who want to collapse what I'm doing into the aesthetic. And there's a background history of an opposition there between agape and eros, which I'm trying to step beyond. It's not an either or. Eros is not bad. It's good unless it violates agape, but they're distinctive. And I'm stopping. I'm going to try and stop within 3 minutes on every question. Those of you who know me well know that's a massive undertaking on my part. So,
can I follow up?
Yes.
This is kind of unrelated to the question. I don't find that book on Amazon. Is it published yet?
No, it's coming out. It's coming out in maybe June.
Okay.
And by the way, this essay, some people, this essay reads a little differently in our immediate context, given everything that's going on in the Middle East. But this was completed a year ago, just to make that clear too. And then this essay is on YouTube. If people wanted to, my idea is to turn this into. There's another chapter too on the flower of faith blooming in the light of agape, which is about this interfaith sort of commonality, which I'm also going to be putting out as a YouTube video, which is also a chapter in the book. And my hope is these things can then be used independently. If the pastor wanted to use it as a conversation starter for their congregation, or if any of you wanted to do it with your folks and then ask me to come in, just not to watch it together like this, but just to have an hour of conversation, that would be great as well.
Very generous of you to make it available and to be such a resource. Others have questions for Dr. Greenway today? We have lots of time left. It was hard to not think of what's happening in the Middle East as you were speaking and not bring that into the forefront of my mind as you were going. And I do have a question around that, but I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna hold my question, and I want to make sure everybody else has a chance to ask theirs first. Libby's logging on for class. I guess that's acceptable.
Isira.
Yeah. You say that the reality of the world is true and not going to change. I think part of what at its best drives some of those rooms that you refer to where decisions are made is the concept of the greater good, the good for more people than not people. And of course, as you would say, that lets everybody slide from your concept, agape. But I wonder what you think about that rationale, that when you have to make the decision in some of those rooms, not all of them, that you're charged with making the decision for what is good for most people under the circumstances.
Yeah, and that's where the absent from rooms where it happens might be a little much of a bit of an overstatement, although it's not clear to me it's a complete overstatement. I think in many rooms where it happens, and many I think especially often of folks in corporate positions where their fiduciary responsibilities and even their legal responsibilities. I think a common reading of the law of Delaware, where so many of the world's largest companies are incorporated, says that officers can't put anything above the shareholders' interests, and that's been commonly interpreted as financial interest. So there's lots of limits, and I always stress this because of some experience I've had with some CEOs who found themselves in positions where what they wanted to do personally was very different from what they were obligated to do legally, and in terms of their fiduciary responsibility, and ultimately in terms of whether or not they would keep the job, or someone else would simply come in and do the exact same thing they didn't want to do. And so that's why I pointed you to Laudato Si and Pope Francis, because it's such a realistic assessment of how to deal with these things. And in their emphasis, one is a lot of times in those rooms, you don't have representation from a diverse enough groups for people really to have a clear vision of the impact. And so this is where not at a conscious level, but in terms of just one's understanding of reality and the impact, it's not clear the decisions being made are actually the ones that are the best for everyone involved. And so one thing that Pope Francis encyclical says, and he was speaking, this is 2015, so this is why all the Trans-Pacific Partnership is being negotiated, right? So you have this massive trade bill whose strategic interest was to counter China, which of course was a legitimate interest, but the way it was used in the room, which included only corporate reps and trade representatives from nation states, no one else. Arguably, a lot of the things that had in it were not for the good for all and did not take in the full range of interests and goods that should have been considered. So what Francis says, he doesn't deny them, he doesn't think we're going to change the world, but he says what we need to do is get into those rooms representatives from diverse populations representing diverse perspectives, and make sure all of those goods are also in the conversation and taken seriously. So and then I'm sharing your point. There is a realism, to say the world's never going to change. It's not to say that we shouldn't engage to always make it better than it would be otherwise. But to acknowledge, it's the whole classic problem of dirty hands, that we're not going to be able to do something which is perfect. This is where I think the Hebrew prophets actually are brilliant in always making eschatological visions eschatological. That's a way of them acknowledging, I think, we know in history we're never going to be perfect. We have hope in a perfect, perfect future, but we realize that future is outside of history, outside of what we can do. Nonetheless, there's this continual call to make things, as good as they can be, to keep moving forward in as good a direction as possible, while remaining realistic about the real world dynamics that are faced. So that is a great question, and I think Francis gives a good response. I think, yeah, I guess I'll leave it with that, or let you respond to that.
Thank you.
Other questions? Carlos types in the chat, we've had more than 2,000 years of imperialistic interpretation of anthropology and sociology by those celebrating Lent. It seems our imperialistic leaders have usurped Lent language to uphold the status quo. What in your opinion, will turn imperialistic rule into agape rule? Great question.
Yeah, and it's kind of linked to the last question. I used to speak to the Texas Campaign for the Environment every 6 months, and it's a secular group, but for 10 years they had me come in. It turns out a lot of them were actually a lot of them were Southern Baptists, Texans. So a lot of them were, but now they're secular. And the thing what I found was environmentalists, when you're working in the political realm, very quickly you it becomes a gamesmanship, right? So you're very much, it's the next campaign, it's this bill, this law, everything's happening fast, and a lot of it is about maneuvering. And then we want to win, we want to get this, and I would always remind them that the precise issues they're fighting for are issues the prophets spoke to 3,000 years ago. About the trees of Lebanon or other sorts of injustices, right? And so that the focus has to be, it can't be, okay, we lost the war on poverty because we still have impoverished people. It has to be, did the Great Society programs result in a lot of people being better off than they would be otherwise? And can we pursue like programs with that hope? In other words, the struggle will simply be ongoing. That's where it's linked to that last question. And we're called to the struggle out of love, and not to win, and not to get ours over against others, but out of love for all. Even if, again, a realistic assessment of how the world works, and just conflicts built into scarce resources, historic power alignments, all the sorts of things, all the systemic distortions that we live on top of, right? It's to be moving constantly, again, with the right motivation, out of love, to make things better than they would have otherwise, to engage in that struggle. And I'd always remind them of that. And I would tell them also, don't forget to take some walks in the wood and just enjoy yourself and take time to care for yourself, because you can't too. But it's got to be that engagement in the struggle, better than it would be otherwise, that is key. If you're focused only on total victory, you're going to burn out and feel like a failure. So when you say that, 2,000 years in terms of, what I was trying to make clear is, this is what it's been from the very beginning, right? This is what the passion of Jesus is. This is how Jesus ends up on the cross. And so, we're called to that passion and that struggle. If what's going to turn it into agape rule, I don't have any. I'm not sure there is an answer to that. It's so incredibly complex and multifaceted, and that's where I think we need people. I think it's in my other essay, the other essay that I talked about, that I'm going to make a YouTube video of. I talk about how encouraging it is that both my students come from all walks of life, a lot of second career students from just all walks of life, and our churches are full of people from all walks of life, right? So they're legislators, they're lawyers, they're attorneys, they're street workers, they're teachers, which means, that's where that salt of the earth sort of metaphor becomes really powerful, that they can help to make a difference in all of these realms, right? To make things better than they would be otherwise, to try to get this vision of agape. And we can hope it will gain more traction and gain. But I'm not, I'm not optimistic that there's going to be some sort of a victory. Again, I think the ancient Israelites and people of other traditions as well were good to say that the eschaton is eschatological. It is outside of history. It's not something we can bring about. It's something we can envision and hope for. And as I suggest in the end, our experience of that love is so powerful. I think it gives us some reasonable hope that somehow it is the final word for each one of us. But that's not something I think that we're going to achieve in history. That idea that we could achieve it, by the way, as vanguard Marxism participated in, right? We can bring about the perfect society, and even if we have to, do a lot of harm on the way, the ends justify the means, because once we transform society by killing all these people and create this perfect society, then it'll all be great. The confusion on that score, as that made clear, is extraordinarily dangerous, right? So this is where I like Gutierrez distinguishes eschatology, eschatological visions, and a realism about history, and the way I'm doing here. In fact, I'm probably borrowing from him and should be gesturing this. He says, yeah, it's great to have those utopian visions, and of course Gutierrez is very much reacting to what's gone wrong in the Soviet Union and other places. He says, but you've got to realize those utopian visions, you always have to be open to correcting them. They're always out there in the future, guiding you forward, but they're not something you can achieve in the near term. So work realistically in the near term, or else you end up with both hopeless expectations and an impetus to a presumption that you know how things should be. And historically, that's often ended up creating terrible harm. I think I use the COVID-19 vaccines as an illustration because I think that is the case. There was a global sense that the Catholic Archbishop in South Africa, when those patent waivers were not granted, right? It's not a matter of not being able to make money from vaccines. It was a matter of whether or not you could make just massive profit or not, or whether or not in a case when the entire globe is at stake, then a decision should have been made. I would say, Cyril, that's a case in which in the rooms where it happened, we did not have agape in the greater good kind of rule, because I mean, it didn't even make sense from a national perspective, because you were allowing the virus to propagate and evolve in other areas, even as you were protecting your own space. It didn't even make sense from a public health standpoint. So in places like that, I think the appeal to the common good, to what's the spirit of agape in the room could make a difference. The other thing I do in all my work is, and this is, I'll just gesture here because it gets too deep, but the main thing I'm doing with agape, and I'm trying to develop something called moral realism theory. So this becomes actually something that's scientifically visible and testable, but I can't get any traction for it yet. But I'm trying to say this is a reality, but this is a reality which is systemically elided from modern rationality. And I won't even start now, but just to say the very languages we speak keep us from affirming the moral reality of agape, which I'm trying to affirm, or what is known as Hesed or Ren, or any number of things. This is why, just a gesture, there's what's known as a crisis of foundation in modern ethics. And so when you take an ethics course in university, you'll get one theory after another. I'm beginning to prattle on. I'm going to stop with that and just say there's another hour-long or semester-long lecture there. But that, I think, does make a difference at a systemic level. As I argue at the beginning of this book, or my last book as well, in the preface or introduction, there is a sense that globally we have all these different religions that are siloed and in competition, and opposed to one another. But in reality, amongst all of the world's religions, because at the heart of them all is this awakening to what we signify with agape, there is a massive consensus about how to respond to people in need, what it is to love, how you treat those who are needy, right? So there's a massive global consensus about fundamental moral calls or ethical reality, which, if it were actually enacted and followed, would make difference in just the lives of billions of people in fundamental ways. This doesn't mean that the quandary issues, the ethical debates that that are kind of the flashpoint debates, those don't get resolved. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this massive consensus about basic, care for others, medical care, food, shelter, clothing, education, things like that. If that consensus were named and unveiled, I think that would have a real power globally, which right now is not there. As I say in my preface to my last book, if you go to the headquarters of the UN in New York and look at everything they have in the UN, you wouldn't know the world had religions, right? It's a bizarre exclusion. Whereas on the other hand, you have a massive global consensus among religions on all of these sorts of issues that people at the UN are passionate about. Why not find and resource that massive area of overlap as a place to be mutually affirming and in community? And then we have our differences. That's what that other essay is about. Oh my gosh, we're almost at time. Let's see if there's another question, or Carlos. Okay, try to do Carlos. Yes. And the only thing I would say that I say in my other work is I don't want it to become, and this is something else that feminists and womanists have really kept us to, is when I am seized by agape for every face, and I live in fidelity to that, I'm seized for my own face as well. So I count too. And so this is another place is a problem in Levinas, where for him it's the other face takes absolute priority, and which leads to dynamics of a failure to affirm and own and see oneself as wholly beloved as well, right? And so I want to be clear that I'm not looking for, in that sense, this is not a self-sacrifice, right? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a living surrender to agape, which is a gracious love, which has me with every other face as well. And so it's not self-negating, which means if you're in a situation with two people where you're being abused or you're being negated, then this agape calls for you to defend yourself and to care for yourself. And that's different from another dangerous tradition, which has come out of this kind of misinterpretation of Lent that I don't want to appear to fall into or to stimulate. Yeah, Isabel.
Hi. So, having said what you just said, then how, as pastors, how far do we go in protecting ourselves from being crucified when we are on the teaching end of this agape love, agape way of being the church, and the message finally gets heard, it finally gets in, and there's a retaliation or a disobedience or something that will not do the agape love, and the pastor is the one that gets hit. There's the pastor who gets
right
laid off or whatever.
That is a great question, and that's where in the end I'm laying out some trajectories, and I don't have a perfect answer, right? So Jesus does end up dying on the cross, right? So doesn't that mean that's what I should do? And in some ways what I just said is no. So it gets tricky. I don't think everyone is called to die. I think the Israelites also, I think when you look at these things and take them and then, well, why do you get these things? You get interesting questions. When you think the classic Hebrew categories of prophet, priest, and king, right? People are called to different roles and they'll have different responsibilities. Cyril, I think he was gesturing to people who are more kings, right? And but not just seeing them as somehow evil. They are caught differently in the dynamic. They have different risks, right? Their risks is to being lost in different ways, right? And then you have prophets. And I think, I mean, you might remember this as well. I tell my students, if you pray that you're not called to be a prophet. If you are one, then you are. But remember, the prophet is the one who has the burning coal. They can't help themselves. And, that's usually a 1 to 2 year call, and then you're finished. And then there's a place for priests who really are in a more intermediate position, and making what to a prophet will look like a compromise, right? And of course, the king is going to look very compromised. And so I think that there's not an easy answer there, because to some degree, and sometimes you might be called to be a prophet to the degree where that really the cross is the thing. I just want to make sure that it is that sort of I can't do otherwise sort of a moment, that it's never done out of a forgetfulness of self, where that's a forgetfulness of oneself as beloved. And so that yourself as beloved, as Jesus knew himself as beloved. And even though you're doing this knowing full well, here are going to be the real world consequences. But to take into that assessment, not just I automatically should do that, but to take seriously the degree to which God loves you too. And so then maybe some people do make strategic compromises in the long run, and sometimes those compromises pay off. I mean, I gestured to Pope Francis, right? Well, Pope Francis, watch the two popes on Netflix if you can get it. Pope Francis, early in his career, was someone who was compromised. If he had died at 35, we would have thought of him as someone who, as a priest, in the context of revolution, when other priests are being killed for standing up for the poor, of holding his cards tight and keeping quiet and keeping safe. It turns out he goes on and becomes Pope Francis, and instigates one of the most radical sort of liberation motifs or trajectories, and maybe because of this past, right? I mean, he may have grown through that. He may have improved, or maybe that was strategic, because Gustavo Gutierrez is never going to become Pope. And if Pope Francis had been one of those people back then, he wouldn't have become Pope now. He wouldn't have this, right? So I am constantly resisting a temptation within myself to have like a nice clean answer for everything, and an oversimplification where you've got easy villains and good guys. It's just far more complex than that. And sometimes, again, especially sometimes with people who have real power, and because of that, they don't have much freedom, ironically enough, because they're so constrained by the power structures which are giving them power. The ways they may be working to make it something better than worse, that may not be visible of necessity, right? Because of what they're doing. So it's very complex dynamic. And that's where I think this graciousness is important, but also cultivating agape, cultivating that awakening to the faces of others. So even as you make, even if you make decisions which are good for the whole, and the others get hurt, well, you better mourn those others, right? That better be costly. That's where modern ethics doesn't have a place for that. Modern utilitarian calculates what's the greatest good for the greatest number, and that's what you do, and that's right, period. I would say if you have a trolley coming down the track and you have a human child on one track and you have an earthworm on the other, then you should save the human child and run over the earthworm. But you better mourn the earthworm. It's a shame you had to kill that earthworm, right? And so if you get someone where they've done the right thing, period, there's no angst, there's no sense, oh my God, I have to live by grace now, then you have then that's a warning sign, right? That you have something else going on, right? And of course, the way the system is built, to some degree, the system's built so that those with the least compunctions about doing such things have the easiest road to the top. And so, but that's where we have to be very understanding of folks who may be feeling in these complex ways, but are not able to show that publicly. And that's where it's a great thing our churches are full of people from all these different perspectives, all these different places, and it's so important to be understanding about the complex positions they occupy. I was at a lunch once with a pastor when I was an intern, and he went to the restroom. It was a what's it called, the Rotary Club lunch. And he went to the restroom, and as soon as he left, one of the people said, "Hey, look, I've got an issue. This guy, came to my office and quit on Thursday, but I haven't processed his paperwork. And on Friday, he came in. He's got a terrible cancer diagnosis, and he asked me to just tear up the papers. If I don't, he's going to lose his insurance. He's not going to have coverage. It's going to be a disaster. On the other hand, he's quit. He did the papers. I've got them. It's done. What do I do?" Right? And which is, it was a long discussion, not a clean answer there. A lot of complexity. But afterwards, I asked him, "Well, why didn't you ask that when the pastor was there?" And he said, "Oh, that just would have killed him." Right? Well, that's that's unfair, right? I know that pastor could have handled it, but sometimes we give the image of having simplistic answers only, and people are hitting such a much more complex reality. So I think we need to signal that. And in a case like that, we may not have a clean answer, but we can help to negotiate one, owning the pain no matter what you do, maybe making a decision, and in the process living in the complexity. I mean, this is what it is to be fallen, right? To confess the fact that we're caught up in this and can't get out, and we live by grace. Because we're caught in these situations, but to keep alive to the grace, to continue, not, because one reaction to that can be denial, even a strident denial, and then that can you harden your heart, and you become less and less sensitive to that, and then that becomes problematic. And ironically enough, you harden your heart out of an initial sensitivity that you can't bear. That's where the Reformed emphasis on grace is so significant, that you only bring the judgment in the context of grace, so that it can be handled. That's where some of these abstract theological ideas, actually, you see they came out of very concrete sorts of trying to deal with real life. People have to go. They have jobs like we all do. And if anyone wants to watch this and have me discuss it, I'd love to. Thank you for being here, and feel free to follow up. It's such a joy, by the way. I know almost everyone here. It's such a joy to see your names and to see you're out there doing okay. So I appreciate. It's a delight too.
And Bill, you said they can find more of this on YouTube by just searching your name.
Yeah, this is on YouTube, and then also I have in YouTube on the one slide you'll see the reference to two other YouTube videos I have on Dolores Williams, the womanist who has a pretty significant take on atonement, but also an advance, in my opinion, beyond Williams by another womanist, Terrell. Marie Terrell, and then I have a video on her. So if you want something that's more focused on atonement theory, you can see those, and then this is working off of that. And then there's a video that's going to be coming on kind of a different way of looking at interfaith relations. And again, if you want to show something like this to your people as a conversation starter, and then ask me to come and be on a Zoom meeting for an hour, actually do 90 minutes. An hour is too short. But do 90 minutes. I would be happy. To do that. So anyway, thank you to Phil and everyone for setting this up.
Yeah, we're grateful to have everybody here again. Thank you, Bill. Join me in thanking Bill as well, everybody. Next week, come back, join us again on March 7th. We'll be with Eric Wall. He'll be discussing songs along the way, music in the Lenten journey. So we hope that you can make it back with us next week as well. Grateful for your time and presence here again, Bill. Thank you so much, and blessings to you all.
Blessings to you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.